But welcome to today's ABN Technical Series session. Today we're joined by Chris White from White Labs, and this presentation or this session is presented in partnership with White Labs. Chris will be talking about the latest innovations to their PurePitch liquid yeast, and he'll also be answering all your questions on yeast and fermentation related issues. So as always, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom. It's a lot easier for us to access the Q&A than the chat, to keep an eye on the chat. So if you pop your questions into Q&A, Chris will be more than happy to answer those. So Chris, I'll fire it across to you now. Take it away. And I'll
well, hello everybody. Yeah, it's great to be here. Yeah, let's get going. I'm speaking to you from San Diego, California. And I know we got a lot of people from a lot of different places. We are making a lot of yeast here every day, working with yeast, happy to talk about anything with yeast. Today I was going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've been working on the last 2 years, and that is the PurePitch Next Generation. And you know, how that works and how it works with yeast. So, and then any other questions on yeast and things like that. So I'll talk for a few minutes and then see what kind of questions you have. But in 2014, we released PurePitch, which was a new way of delivering yeast, you know, growing it in film, sealing in that and delivering it. So there was no oxygen pickup. So there was no possibility for contamination with environmental contact. And so you get a really long shelf life on the yeast without the oxygen pickup and the CO2 released from the film. Now we wanted to take it to the next level and have it easier to use, that same great yeast, but easier to use with a port and handles. And so we introduced it to the world this week. A project, again, we've been working on for 2 years and with lots of brewers, lots of feedback, really understanding what people wanted and how to use liquid yeast better. So that's my little introduction. Charles, you or anybody else, do you have any way we want me to take that?
Okay, so I was expecting a little bit. I thought there'd be a little bit more. Can you tell us?
Yeah. I just don't want to talk too long.
Yeah,
somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah. What are the changes you've made to the PurePitch? I mean, what are the new innovations you brought, and how do they come about? Because I understand you listen to the brewers, what they told you, what they wanted in the changes to the PurePitch, and you've taken that and incorporated into that into a new design. So you know, how did that process come about?
Yeah, the one thing about PurePitch and yeast is we don't have a packaging line, right? We don't just fill a whole bunch of things because that's the whole uniqueness of PurePitch. We don't introduce oxygen by having a filling line and a packaging line. So it's really about the reactor we grow the yeast in. And one of the things a lot of the brewers told us in the United States is they want a cap. They don't like the scissors, you know, even though that really created a really great place for the yeast to be in after we grew it, where we didn't introduce oxygen and things like that, as I just mentioned. But putting a cap on something that is something that we grow the yeast in is pretty complex, and it's something I've been wanting to do since 2014. So the last 2 years we really concentrated on that because obviously you know, a cap makes it a lot more usable. You can use half of it, a third of it, whatever, cap it up again if the cap is right and the package is right. And that's what we're able to do. And also with the handles, and size it perfectly, you know, optimizing it for 5 hectoliters, a pitching rate of 7.5 million cells per mil. So it's really modular. You can use a whole bunch of them or one of them or half of them and get the pitching rate you want. We created an online calculator on yeastman.com that is specific to this PurePitch Next Generation, but also it has a sliding dial, which is pretty novel. So you can go, what pitching rate do you want? Here's our recommendation: use 1 per 5 hectoliters. Use half per half for 2.5 hectoliters, which was the old nano size, which we still have now for a while. But what do you want as a brewer or that particular beer style? So it gives, that was also another separate part of this project, making that pitch rate calculator in a new way. And so we did a lot of things over the last 2 years, wrapping around PurePitch Next Generation. So it's not just a package with a cap, because again, we don't have a packaging line to just say, oh, put a cap on it. We created a new reactor to grow the yeast in. We made this film fused 2-layer film. So instead of 2 different 2 layers, it's a fused 2-layer with a nice breathable interior layer that has the yeast really more slippery inside, so it gets out better. It has a laser perforated outside fused together, so the gas escapes better than it used to. Get optimized for this 5 hectoliter size. So it's 1.75 liters at 2.15 billion cells per mil to give you 7.5 billion cells per mil. Really listening, again, what do the brewers want? What pitching rate do brewers want? How do they want to use it? You can take a whole bunch up on a ladder now with the handles. We have some ways that we're working on that's also going to come out later about how to use it in line and aseptically, and that's pretty exciting. And so we did a long beta release with customers where we went and brewed with them. San Diego and Asheville originally, where our facilities are. As the pandemic opened up a little bit in different parts of the United States, we were able to go to Texas and then other states in Canada and work with brewers there to use this, listen to them, make some changes. Then we did a soft release where people were buying it for a little while when no one else knew it was available. And now we are introducing it to the world and saying, okay, here it is. And we have it in WP001 and WP066, 2 of our kind of larger volume strains where we have to make lots of reactors anyway, every day of these different strains. So we can do those 2 strains right now. And then of course we have another dozen coming in soon. And then eventually all of the yeast strains and then homebrew as well will be into a new PurePitch Next Generation package.
Okay, well, which strains are you looking to bring in as your next in your next run?
We're going to do lager yeast, WP 830, our German lager yeast. We're going to do the Hefeweizen yeast. We're going to do WP 007, our dry English ale yeast, and some of the other ones into wit yeast and Belgian yeast.
And is this going to make it easier for shipping overseas as well? Because obviously a lot of our listeners are based out in Asia. Will that have an effect at all in packets coming across to Asia?
It's a big deal to do with Asia because, one of the things we always think about with liquid yeast is these living cells that breathe out CO2 is how do you ship it around the world so it's in great shape? Pretty easy for us to ship from California to Nevada or to Oklahoma, but how about Singapore? How about Hong Kong? How about China? And all sorts of places. So obviously longer shipping times to Asia, sometimes customs things that we have where it's held and sometimes on purpose in cold conditions, but still there's a time period there. And our film was made to breathe CO2 in the past, but not always optimally for those long transit times. So we were able to really focus on what's the best film for that CO2 transfer to allow, because CO2 inside of a package with yeast is not great for the yeast. And so one thing we realized a long time ago is if we can release the CO2, that's why we're using the film, we can get healthier yeast delivered over long transit times. And so we were able to really focus on that and also think about the batch sizes made in Asia. What batch sizes are people making? What cell counts do people want? So Asia had a big part of how we came out with PPNG. And that was through a lot of visits by myself and others at White Labs and talking to brewers there.
Yeah. Again, just listening to kind of what size their brew houses are. Because I guess typically the brew houses are slightly smaller in Asia at the moment than they are in the US. So is that hence the smaller packaging? Yeah. Will you be bringing out larger packaging? Because obviously you've got the likes of Michael Jordan, who's a big fan of yours, out in he's in Encanto now, and they've got 50-hectare brew house there. So you're going to be making him some big packets.
Yeah, well, the beauty of PurePitch is that's how we keep it pure. We put it in a size right when we make it, so we never open it again. So what I wanted with this was the most lightweight, easy to use format that you could use 1 or you could use 100. So with it's so easy to open and add and hold a whole bunch of them. So you don't need something customized for a larger size. You can order more of them. And that's why we're also working on this aseptic way of using it. So you don't have to keep a man-way door opener or something like that. You can just add it in with the wort.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, we got some questions coming in. So if anybody has any questions, it could be on the PurePitch Next Generation, or it could just be on anything to do with fermentation in your brew house. Please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. The first question coming in is, Chris, can you discuss best practices for yeasts which provide the best hop biotransformation characteristics? So that's the big buzzword at the moment is biotransformation, isn't it? So what kind of best practices tips do you have?
Yeah, that's a big deal. Hazy IPAs have had phenomenal growth around the world. I do believe that any kind of beer styles centered around IPAs have long staying power, but hazies are something that nobody really predicted. Like, why would people want to make a hazy beer, right? Not a West Coast IPA or something else. Well, they've really been popular with customers, and consumers love the mouthfeel and the juiciness of these hazy beers. And so that early dry hopping with different yeast strains is really key. Now, a lot of people are still working on what that biochemistry of the transformations are. It's easy to say transformation, but it's a little harder to measure the biochemistry going on. So we have an R&D lab here in San Diego that has a collaboration going on long-term with studying biotransformations. And we have some work we want to publish soon on that, and looking at the genetics within these strains, which is part of another project we were working on, and saying what gene should we be looking at to characterize a yeast strain if it's going to be good with biotransformation. But what a lot of brewers have found out, and us has found out, is particular yeast strains seem to maximize that juiciness, which is why we want to look at the genetics of the yeast strains. So the yeast strain that we had since the late 90s was a yeast strain we call East Coast Ale Yeast, WP008, because these kind of cloudy, hazy beers have actually been a long-term thing on the East Coast of the United States. And that's why they were first called East Coast kind of IPAs. And it maintains a really nice long-term haze because it's a chain-forming yeast, but it doesn't necessarily have the chain-forming means it's not flocculent. It just the buds don't break off. So you get these long chains of yeast that form these big precipitates kind of permanent in the beer. But it doesn't really give you that juiciness that people are looking for. So the main yeast strain, and the one that's in the PPNG, is our London Fog Ale yeast, and that gives you that big juicy character with that early dry hopping based on these biotransformations that are clearly happening, that are not happening with 008. The biochemistry of that and the genetics of that is why we're still researching it.
So it's still a lot of work to be done on what exactly is happening.
Yeah, but what we do know is the yeast strain is important that you use. That early dry hopping is important. I know a lot of people say that it's hard to repitch yeast from these early dry hop beers, but another little tidbit I can say from experience is that when I started, the first beer that kind of fit this kind of program was Hefeweizen yeast. Hefeweizens were something that, some breweries made once in a while, and all of a sudden in the 90s, everybody wanted to make one and keep it on tap. But everybody said, oh, you can't repitch Hefeweizen yeast. Well, everybody figured it out because the breweries here in the United States, want to repitch. They're buying liquid yeast. They got a lot of liquid yeast If these beer styles are growing, they want to make it. I went to a brewery 6 months ago or so in San Diego when I could, that talked about how when they started making hazies, they didn't repitch the yeast because, you know, it's hard to repitch yeast from a beer you dry hop so early. But then these beers became such a dominant part of their portfolio, they had to, and they just started doing it, and it worked fine. So I think brewers can always repitch the yeast when they want to. It's figuring out a few tips, like what day should you collect it, what day should you dry hop it. So this particular brewery dry hopped it a little bit later than they were and collected the yeast a little earlier than they were used to.
Have you done any research on that? I mean, is there any way that people can find your recommendations on when would be a good time to be harvesting, or when would be a good time to be dry hopping?
No, we don't have any particular white paper research on that. But again, just talking to brewers and saying, you know, for the folks listening that maybe think, oh gosh, I can't repitch from there. Everybody I talk to now is repitching from there. So it's not as hard as it sounds. It's modifying it a little bit. I mean, you don't have to, when you're collecting yeast from the bottom of a fermenter and you're getting 5 times the amount of yeast you need from a hazy beer, for example, maybe you only get enough to repitch once. But it's still a lot of yeast that you can collect from the bottom of a fermenter, and the hops don't do that big a deal. They don't kill the yeast. They add to the yeast. They're in there, but they're otherwise we wouldn't be able to make these beers in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, so basically get onto the forums, find out what other people are doing. That's probably the best way for them to get and just try.
Well,
experiment.
I would say just do it.
No.
They're not gonna find that much in the forums either, except doing it and tweaking their collection times. Plus or minus, 10 hours, plus or minus 10 hours on the dry hopping.
So just do it, just get into your brewery and do it.
And realize that people are doing it. And this is not something new to hazies. That's why I was bringing up the Hefeweizen example. People were scratching their head how to do it with Hefeweizens. And then, they just started doing it, and it's okay. I mean, there was a time when West Coast IPAs came out too in the early 2000s. Imagine a beer industry without IPAs, but that used to be the case. And when IPAs came out, people said, oh, you can't dry hop from an IPA. I'm sorry, you can't collect yeast from an IPA. And then they started doing it and going, oh gosh, the yeast is great from an IPA. There's nothing wrong with this yeast. It's got some hops in it. But and in fact, a lot of breweries found that their best yeast was repitched from their dry hop beers.
I remember you presented a slide that a couple of years ago in Seoul, and it was an experiment you did at the brewery, which you used one pitch and showed how you made 27 different beers with that one strain of yeast, and there were hazes in there. There were all sorts of different kind of beers in there, and it all came from that one strain. You just repitched it, split it, repitched it, and moved it off into different tanks and things. So you just experiment basically, is it?
Yeah, good memory, Charles. Thank you. You're watching the seminars.
I was awake.
I think that it's not only in repitching, but there's that kind of common theme happens a lot when I go to breweries, and I go to one brewery and they go, oh, I could never do this. And I go to 10 other breweries and they go, yeah, I just did this. It worked really, really good. And, Mitch Steele, who worked at Stone Brewery in San Diego for a long time, he gave a talk one time on repitching from IPAs. And that helped really finally get people to go like, oh, you know what? This is really good yeast. And the new style that comes, and a new style comes, and the same, we might think the same thing. Oh gosh, I can't repitch from this, but you can. Yeast is a living organism that's environmental. These are select industrial strains that have been cultivated by brewers, but they have longevity, the want for more growth, and we're just trying to treat them as carefully as possible to make sure we get the best beer flavors.
Just let them do their work.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So
the more they work, the happier they are.
keep them happy, and keep working hard. Okay, so we've got some more questions coming in. A quick one from Peter Simmons. Will the packaging be available for home brewers? You mentioned that earlier on with your PurePitch Next Generation.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of parallel projects with this. I mentioned the calculator. I mentioned some of the other things that we've been working on, and making the yeast better itself while we have this opportunity, and adding a qPCR step. And the other thing is, the other project is homebrew. So it is definitely in the works, and we will have homebrew yeast in PurePitch Next Generation that will have a cap and some of the features of the film and the calculator and things like that. So that's still in the works. It hasn't been released yet, but it will.
Do you have a timeline on that, roughly, when you're hoping to have it out?
Oh, Charles, we're a small company.
Later this year, early next year, year after?
Yeah, later this year, early next year. Yeah. I mean, I would have liked it already by now, but working through this thing in the whole pandemic. I mean, it started 2 years ago, but then the pandemic started, which was a positive and a negative, right? There was a lot of things we couldn't get through suppliers. We couldn't work with new film. There's things we couldn't do. Homebrew definitely got slowed down. But there's also some positives where we were able to work every day. We had meetings every day with this PurePitch Next Generation team, and we had several different teams, and we've been working on it every day for 2 years, and especially during the pandemic, where we just could use brain power, and sit around and talk about, well, we did this experiment, that experiment. Let's try this. Let's move the edge to here. Let's put the cap here. Let's what size do we want on the homebrew? What size do we want on the pro? How does the calculator work? So since the industry went down a little bit and we had people still working here, we were able to really focus a lot on our teams and our just meeting times. And while things didn't happen as fast again for some of the other reasons, we also got a lot out of it from that, and the brewers we were able to work with, and the home brew stores we were able to work with. So now we're full speed.
Good news. I mean, it's great. You're using that time well. Some companies obviously have struggled in the downtime, but it's very important to keep moving forward, isn't it? It's just, you've got to keep moving somehow. You've got to do something. You've got to innovate. You've got to stay one step ahead. You've got to keep rolling on.
Yeah,
that's good. It's a small company, but big ambitions.
Yeah, well, I mean, we just try to innovate. We're trying to. I mean, the mission all along has been, we can make the best yeast possible, the best beers can be made. And I always thought our business would grow if people can make better beer. And I care about beer and brewers. So, I mean, I want the best beer to be made. And that's driven us through these various innovations, from the starter company to making pitchable liquid yeast available, to then doing PurePitch. Not about making yeast for, less money, because it costs more money for us to make yeast this way. The mission has been, the yeast will be better to the brewery, and then the beer will be better. And then our business will grow and our jobs will grow that way.
That's nice to see. Nice to see out in Asia more as well. There's more people using your yeast out in Asia. There's obviously the logistical problems of getting it over here. You're managing to address those, get it into the market over here.
Yeah.
Good to see. Great. Okay, so another question from Doug. Thanks very much for tuning in, Doug. It's great to have you here. He says, for those of us interested in saison styles, which yeast do you recommend for very dry farmhouse characteristics? So brewers seem to use a variety of yeasts, some not using the saison yeast at all. So which yeast would you recommend for a very dry farmhouse?
Yeah, I think saisons have taken a little bit of hit with the hazies. I really feel like there's been, we saw that interest in saisons going down as hazies were going up, but they aren't gone. So thank you for asking that, because it's a wonderful style. And I love the dry saisons. Yeah, our WLP 590, our French saison yeast, is one of my favorites because it's got that big phenolic component, which I think is why you want to really use a real saison yeast. It's not just phenolic because it's not a brewer's yeast. You want to use one that's phenolic, that's been selected for saisons. And the French saison yeast is so dry. And I think that's the best balance for a saison, the phenolic component and the dryness.
Okay. So don't just play around with other yeast. You just want that's what you want to go for. Just it's a yeast specific for dry saisons, and that's
well, that's what we've been able to do too with our brewery. We have a brewery in San Diego and in North Carolina, and we have tap rooms that we can serve the beers to, and then we can ask people. So we always generally have a saison on, and one of the fun saisons to do is the same recipe, same batch. We put in 2 small fermenters with 590 and 565, kind of the normal Belgian saison yeast we sell. And we have found when we do surveys that it's kind of 50-50. A lot of people like the 565, the main saison yeast that's big and phenolic and things like that, but half the people like the 590 with the dryness that comes along with it, and I'm in that camp.
Okay, so you're 590, a 590 boy.
Yes.
All right. Okay, another question. Chris, where do you see the trends in yeast going in general? So the types of yeasts, significant demand differences according to regions in the world, other developments in yeast technology you'd like to share. So a few elements to that one. So I guess we start with where do you see trends in yeast going?
It has a lot to do with what new beer styles people are thinking about. And that's not up to us, right? That's the brewers being creative, making new beer styles. So many of these beer styles we didn't even know would come out. And a lot of them have a particular yeast strain, like the Kvike yeast. No one kind of saw that coming. The hazies and their interaction with the yeast for the biotransformations. The hard seltzers in the United States, I'm not sure how popular it's been in Asia. It hasn't been that popular in Europe. You're seeing that?
Yeah, they're starting to appear now. Yeah.
Okay. Surprisingly, in the United States, craft brewers, which were kind of always regulated to make something with malt, were allowed to make hard ciders with water. And people said, "Oh, I got to use a distilling strain. I got to use something else." It's not the yeast strain that was having a problem with the fermentations. It was a nutrient profile, because brewers are used to fermenting a really nutrient-rich malted barley solution that has amino acids and minerals and things like that. And so they would use the brewer's yeast, and something wouldn't work. So people would say, "Oh, I got to use this fuel alcohol yeast or something and make something that didn't taste very good." And actually, that's not true. You can use your brewer's yeast strain and repitch it from a beer. You just need the right nutrient profile in that water. So we released a hard seltzer nutrient last year that was part of another team to work on, and other companies have. It's the nutrient profile that really makes a difference. So you should use the yeast you want to use in that particular thing, hard seltzer, for example, as long as you have the right nutrient profile. And there are styles that are, there'll probably be a new article tomorrow on a new style that will surprise us, or next week, and then we try to listen.
And so how long would it take you to identify a particular strain that works well in a certain style? So if you need to bring a new strain to market, what's the process there for you? Does it take you 6 months, a year to kind of identify a new strain, to get it ready for brewers for a new style of beer?
Generally a minimum of 3 months, but it can take 6 months, yes, because there's a lot that goes into yeast selection, trials with customers, flavor chemistry, looking at that. So the minimum is about 3 months, and that would be something super fast. But we release different strains. We released some Nuka yeast last year. We have a strain we call Appalachian Sour we released this year, and a few other strains. So we have 6 or 7 strains we're working on still right now to release through the end of this year and into 2022. And we don't really rush it. It takes a little time.
Would they be already in your yeast bank and you'd start playing around with it, or do you have to go out and find a new yeast and bring it into your collection?
A little bit of both. Sometimes we have something in the collection that we've been working on for a while, and we're finding what we might want to do with that yeast strain. A lot of times we go and collect yeast strains and then start working with it through maybe a beer style that's kind of emerging, or a different concept, or something we might want to add to a blend that has the concept we're looking for, such as a sour.
Okay, and I guess the second part of the question is, what regional differences in demand do you see? Do you see a difference in the yeast that people are asking for in America, in Asia, in Europe, in Australia? Are they different demands around the world?
Yes and no. There's a lot that's very similar about what people are asking around the world, because wherever we are in the world, we might have different cultures and different food, but some of the craft beers we're making are pretty similar. Some styles might be more popular than other styles. But for example, we have the White Labs Copenhagen, and they've been doing really well, and Europe is opening more, and new breweries are going in, and so it's good to see that happening. So they buy a little less a proportion of our California ale yeast than we sell in the United States, but still that's their top selling yeast. So while it's not as percentage wise the higher, it's still the highest for them. And then the hazy strains like 066 are still doing very well there. There's a little bit more interest in some of the stouts and porters and things like that. So some of the English strains have a little more popularity in Europe than they do in the United States. In Australia, New Zealand, I see a very high popularity of Kolsch beers and blonde beers and things like that. And the hotter climates at times, a more drinkable beer. But throughout the industry, there's also a rise of lagers, and craft breweries saying, what can we do with lagers? Maybe not just a mainstream lager that competes on a price with a Tiger or something like that, but something that you can make with all malt and crafty and still have your story behind it. We made a Helles at our brewery here in San Diego recently, and it took 8 weeks to make. We followed a real traditional, Bavarian process, and came out with something wonderful. It's going to be hard to replicate, especially when it's 8 weeks. But for us, it's selling very fast in our tasting rooms. I have a glass of it right here. I mean, it's it's 8 o'clock at night here in San Diego, so almost. That's okay. I think it's okay to have a beer.
That's okay for you. Yeah, it's only 10 o'clock in the morning for us. So we've got to wait a couple of hours at least until the sun's overhead.
Right.
So, but I mean, what would you recommend with if you're playing around with lager yeasts to make a difference? Yeah, to make your lager a little bit different. Would you say play around with some different yeasts, or put in some different hop additions, play around with the aroma? Yeah, what are you seeing is differentiating craft lagers from the regular mass produced lagers?
I think it's looking at what styles of lager you want to make. Do you want to make a Helles? Do you want to make a Bock? Do you want to make a blonde Bock? A 65 IBU Pilsner, looking at that lager realm, but then thinking about how do you differentiate it there. I think the traditional lager yeasts are awesome, and they should be used. I mean, you can always use, California ale yeast or something like that, and try to lower the temperature as low as possible. But you still don't get that full spectrum of the esters and the sulfur that you find in a traditional lager. You can add a bit of head pressure onto a fermenter for lagers and ferment under 1 bar, 15 psi, and get a faster fermentation, because what the pressure does is lower yeast growth. Well, what does cold fermentation do? Lower yeast growth. So if you ferment under pressure with lager, you get lower yeast growth, but then you can raise the temperature to closer to an ale temperature and get a higher speed lager. Doesn't still have the same spectrum exactly of a lager, but you're able to output the lagers at a higher temperature with a faster speed, still using traditional lager yeast.
Okay, so I guess that would be a shortcut to get it out quicker, but you would still recommend patience, give it time, lager it properly.
Yeah, I've been able to do a lot of sensories with different people doing that. And we've done some here with the pressure and no pressure, and the beer I can still pick out in sensory is the cold fermented lager with the same yeast strain. But when it's not side by side, maybe not, but it still tells me, hey, that's the best traditional way to do it, the best flavor characteristics. And whatever, there's not too many craft breweries built as a lager brewery, and it almost doesn't make sense to build, because what you have to have is a whole bunch of cellaring tanks and time. And if you have, a lot of breweries will put in 10 fermenters and 2 conditioning tanks. If you make a lager brewery, you're going to have 10 fermenters and 40 conditioning tanks. So that just doesn't really make as much sense right now. But you could make ales, and then you could make some lagers, right? You can use some of your space for lagers and say, look, this is going to be 8 weeks. I'm going to make it. I'm going to give it the time. And 2 weeks later, I'm going to make another one that's going to last 8 weeks, or maybe when that one's done. But it's another way to just spur an interest in your brewery and offer a broad spectrum of beers, from maybe a hard seltzer if you want to a lager, to an amber, to a Hefeweizen or something, and then lead them towards IPA. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, the IPA is where you're going to keep that customer, whether it's a hazy, whether it's a West Coast, whether it's a hoppy pale ale. And that's not something I think that's different between Asia, North America, and Europe.
Just climb them into it gradually, as opposed to going straight hard at the IPA, going, here you go, you're a lager drinker, straight into a big hazy IPA. I mean, it's a tough transition to make for a lot of people.
It does take a while. And when I started traveling to Asia, people would tell me, hey, Chris, IPAs aren't going to do good here. No one's used to them. And my main response to that was, well, when IPAs came popular in the United States, we didn't have them either. I mean, Bud Light was pretty far from an IPA. So it just took tasting and enjoying and getting into the whole craft beer scene. IPAs didn't materialize out of nothing. They kind of came from ambers, actually. So ambers were the gateway beer. And then we did something else. And then we got into IPAs. And it has a staying power with the consumer that I think is important for breweries to just keep in mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think some people forget that we've come in Asia probably in the last 10 years. That took the US 20 or 30 years to get to that stage. So Asia is moving so fast. So sometimes people do get left behind because people just jump straight in. The breweries jump straight in at an IPA. But they forget, well, hang on a second, we've got to pick up these the consumers and bring them into that IPA and
you got to cultivate that consumer. So you want to move them through that flavor profile. I was in this industry in the 90s, and there was no IPAs, right? So I started traveling, and people, San Diego got really well known for these IPAs that were coming out of San Diego. But I could travel anywhere. It didn't have to be outside the United States. It could be Colorado. It could be Mexico City. It could be wherever. And people would say, oh, those IPAs are horrible. they're so unbalanced.
Mm.
So there was a lot of resistance to it within, you know, near where I was as well. But what people weren't listening to, I think, was the consumers. They just get more interested, and it's the niche that's made craft beer. I believe our industry is the size it is because of this category.
Because of the IPAs. Okay, so we're going to jump. We're going to jump categories now to the Belgian wit. So we have a question. What's the best pitching rate for Belgian wit strains?
So Belgian wit's another interesting thing, because as we've been talking about IPAs for a little bit, but the Belgian style beers and their flavor characteristics are also something that are quite unique and also very, very crafty. It's something that craft breweries, I believe, should always have in their portfolio, you know, whether it's a wit or a double or a triple or a sour. And a Belgian ale, you know, I think it's an important part of the portfolio. So the Belgian wit is one of my favorite styles. These are lower gravity beers that have a lot of flavor. They're flavor forward, yeast flavor forward beers, right? That's kind of what I think of the Belgian beers. Very yeast driven characteristics, along with everything else. But it's really important that we're getting the right ester profile and that phenolic component. So if you're talking about a pitching rate, you know, between 5 and 7 million cells per mil, is going to give you that kind of growth you need. You don't want 15 million cells per mil. You don't want these high pitching rates, because you're not going to get the growth that you need to create the flavor components that you want in the beer.
Okay. So,
and Belgian wit's a little easier, because the same thing could be said for some of the Trappist styles, but those are a little higher gravity, so you got to be a little more careful.
Okay, so pitch low is your advice for the Belgian wit.
Yeah.
Okay. What are your tips for increasing yeast vitality and viability when harvesting and repitching yeast? So this in reference to temperature, time after completion of fermentation, etc.
You got to be on it. You realize that you have a living organism in that fermenter, and when the gravity hits terminal gravity, you want to remove the yeast. It's not doing anything anymore. It's sitting in the cone. Its temperature is higher than the beer because it's insulating itself. And you know, you might have a great 95, 96% viability one day and 82 the next day. So in general, it's actually pretty easy. I mean, you know, but there's some guidelines like that, like get it out. The reason why a lot of people don't like cone to cone pitching is you kind of leave it there until you make another beer. Nothing really wrong with cone to cone pitching. It's just kind of sits there, you know, which gives you a little lower viability. But a lot of breweries have grown for a long, long time with cone to cone pitching because it's kind of easy. But you want to collect it into a yeast brink, ideally, when the fermentation's done. Keep the CO2 from building up because it's still kind of active. And I talked about CO2 earlier and how it related to PurePitch Next Generation. And use it within best practice within 2 weeks. But that's yeast you collected, you know, after it was done. So that's where the vitality comes in. And it takes practice. There's nothing really super hard about it. You know, when I meet people, which is common actually, you know, in different parts of the world that say, oh, I don't collect yeast, it's too hard. You just haven't tried it. Honestly, it's not that hard, right? We'll give you the best practice ideas, but most brewers that started in the United States, within a few days, they're repitching yeast. That's what they're taught. It's not a complex laboratory specific thing. It's part of the brewing practice that brewers have done for hundreds of years. So it should be something that's done in Asia and Europe and other places that if you want to, and you don't have to, but it's how you can use the most yeast strains. It's how you can harvest the power of your yeast by collecting it.
I mean, do you need to be adding any specific nutrients in that's going to help the vitality of the yeast while it's sitting in the brink, or just keep it there?
No, you don't want to do anything with it, really. You don't want to wash it. I mean, I had to talk about that. I talk about it sometimes because people want to, but the nutrient-rich wort that you fermented the beer in is the best place for yeast to be in, even though they've stripped most of the nutrients out of there. But it's got alcohol, things like that are protective. You want to just collect the yeast. You want to store it cold. You want to keep the CO2 off of it, and you want to use it within 2 weeks. Right. And if it's not pure, then the brewery has a problem, right? If there's a purity issue, there was a problem with the yeast. There was a problem with the yeast handling. Not reusing the yeast is not going to fix that problem, right? That problem needs to be fixed. There should be no problem from a purity perspective of reusing yeast 5 or 10 times. Again, if it is, there's a problem with the beginning yeast or the yeast handling, which is also no big deal because it happens. It's not like, oh gosh, I'm a terrible brewer, I got a contamination. No, just fix it. It happens. You're not making beer in a sterile environment. You're CIPing things with chemicals that maybe there's a turn in your pipes that is not hidden a certain the chemical load and things like that. But my main point is, if there's a contamination fear over repitching, well, you got to fix the contamination part. That has nothing to do with repitching, right?
As a process,
if your brewery is not clean enough to repitch yeast, you got to fix that.
Yeah, and that's your processes, your CIPs. Yeah. Okay. Back to the PurePitch Next Generation. What is the shelf life, or will the shelf life be longer for the PurePitch Next Generation?
Yeah, well, so when I was talking about reusing yeast from your fermenters in 2 weeks, it's because beer from a fermentation is about 50% viable after 1 month. So, but we can still have 95% viable yeast for months because that's this process. So because of the way we grow it in the film, the breathability, and so far with PurePitch Next Generation, the viability is stronger and stronger because of the more breathing of the film. We're still labeling it for 4 months, which is really long for liquid yeast. And then on the homebrew side, it's 6 months, but same yeast, but just kind of the difference of the commercial and the retail environments. Somebody just used some WP001 California L yeast in Mexico during our soft release of PurePitch Next Generation. And some things happened, they used it a little bit later than they wanted to, and it was 70 days old, and it was 96% viable.
So you're still getting some good results.
Yeah, that just doesn't usually happen with yeast and liquid yeast. Yes, so yeah. That's a bit part of this investment in our process to make PurePitch, to make PurePitch Next Generation, is to have that long shelf life, so we can ship it to Asia.
Okay. I guess another age-related question. What's the oldest yeast that you've rejuvenated or restored from an inactive state into a usable yeast for brewing?
Again, that almost kind of comes from customers, right? And we hear that a little bit more in Australia than anywhere else for whatever reason, where they've had yeast. There was one not that long ago that a home brewer had that was over 2 years old. And they didn't make a starter, and they used it, and they were surprised the fermentation was normal. The thing about that is there's billions of cells per mil. So even when there's some cell death, there's still billions of cells per mil, especially with the shelf life that we can get in our yeast. But the other side of that is you could always build up a culture. It's one of the things we kind of, pride ourselves on a little bit is we don't just make a batch of California L yeast 1 month and 2 months later make another one. Think about your own breweries, right? You make a batch of this beer, a month later or 2 months later, you make a batch of that beer. We don't do that with our yeast. We make that yeast every single day from a petri dish. So every single day we have new yeast coming off, and we're packaging it. It doesn't keep growing. And again, that's an investment in our process to make sure that we've got really, really healthy yeast that we are shipping around. So you probably can't find a container of White Labs liquid yeast around the world that you could not resuscitate and make a batch of beer out of.
Yeah, I think one of the things he was getting at as well was kind of, have you been involved in digging up any pots from the Egyptian desert and what was kind of the oldest yeast you've been involved with in reviving? Have you done any of those kind of projects?
Yeah, we've worked with some pirates. These guys like to call themselves pirates. And did a fun one from a ship that left Hull, England, and it got in an accident with a Danish ship near Copenhagen, or near Denmark anyway. And we were able to work with those guys when they pulled out the yeast. This was 1866. And resuscitated the yeast, and McKellar made some beer with it. Some other people have made some beer with it. And we still have those, that yeast strain, and we've done a couple of those other ones since then, and they're really interesting strains. And they're not phenolic. The phenolic nature, non-phenolic nature of brewer's yeast went away a long time ago as part of the domestication. You can always collect wild yeast from around and use it, see if it makes alcohol, but it'll usually be phenolic. The fun thing is, if you can find some of these old strains, from a ship or something that's been in the bottom of the ocean, cold ocean for a while, that's not phenolic.
But generally speaking, are these strains that they're not ones that are going to go out onto the market, because beer has changed so much in the past 100, 200 years that it's not a strain that's likely to be picked up and used in mass circulation?
It's a really good question. We have some old strains. We constantly collect strains. We have some old, Russian strains from before communism, when there was a lot of breweries, and they're really interesting strains. We have a lot of strains like that from different parts of the world, and we wonder if we should do something with them or make them. But I guess it comes back to the same things your brewers are listening to, saying like, okay, you want to make this thing, are people going to buy it? What format could we make? How much could we make of it? So, gosh, this is stuff we ask ourselves a lot.
How much would you have to make it for it to be a viable experiment for you to actually put it out onto the market? And how much would you have to produce?
Well, we make a huge variety already. We make 80 strains a week in all this fresh lots. So we have the ability to make fairly small runs, but how do you sell something when people don't know about it? We could make a few hundred sort of packages, but we have to sell them within a few weeks.
Yeah. So it's everything else associated with it. How do you get it out to the breweries? How do the breweries know about it? Do they want to use it in the first place? So I guess it's a case of them all getting together, going, right, we're 100 breweries and we're going to brew all over America this one particular strain, and then you go, okay, then I can do that for you. But other than that, it becomes quite difficult to pull out something from the past.
Yeah, maybe people in the audience have better ideas than we do, but we're still so we started a program we call Vault, where we have all these other yeast strains besides our core 80 strains that we say, okay, how can we add these in from the vault? And we're getting better at it, but it's still hard to actually get a mechanism to make those strains, right? So we had a homebrew mechanism for stores to kind of get them, a pro mechanism, but it still needs to get better. We're still working on how, if we want to come out with a vault strain, how can everybody get it without us making batches that get thrown away?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. So let's do some quick fire ones for you now, Chris.
Okay.
Okay, so Michael, down in Bali. Here we go. He says, "Hi, Chris. I tuned in a bit late. Brew day here. What's the recommended pitch rate for lager yeasts on cold fermentations around the 10 degrees C range with the new PurePitch packaging?"
Hello, Michael. So what we have is we have actually instructions on each package, which is nice. But so that 1.75 liter at 2.15 billion cells per mil, it says one for an ale to give you 7.5, two for lager at low fermentation temperature to give 15, and 3 if you're low temperature and high gravity. So we're looking at the broad spectrum of what brewers are doing today. So we recommend 15 million cells per mil for a lager at 10C. So that would be 2 of those packages per 5 hectoliters. So we took lagers really into account, and we wanted to put the instructions right there because we tell people that with the old, with the PurePitch method, but a lot of people would buy, it's not stamped on the package, right? And so we actually found that by putting those instructions on the package, even though somebody's already bought it, there's been, people have just said to us, thank you for putting that on there. Because sometimes they're not the ones buying it. Maybe purchasing departments buy it, and they want to make sure they're getting the right amount. So we like you to pitch 15 million cells per mil. You could also, go to our calculator and add and move that dial per Plato if you want, and say maybe you want a certain pitching rate, millions of cells per mil per degree Plato. So you can do that on the calculator as well. But the simple label instructions are 2 per 5 hectoliters to give you 15. And the funny thing during these beta trials is how things have changed. Brewers are fermenting so much colder over here than they used to. And you can ask yourselves in Asia if you're doing this, but so many of these lager trials, it used to be everybody pitched at 20 degrees C, 18 and 20, but now they're at 16, 15. That's getting close to lager temperatures, right? But so many of the knockouts are happening cold. You need more yeast, which is why we really try to optimize the concentration for the PurePitch Next Generation to make sure people were using enough, because that's a kind of a shift that's happened. And we're still able, with this pitching rate, a little more foolproof, we're able to get people into good fermentation times, regardless of that little cooler, whether in the cooler on the ale category or cooler in the lager category.
Okay, great. Okay, here we go. We're talking about new strains. So, Chris, what yeast strain would you recommend for cold IPA?
Cold IPA. Well,
yeah.
I mean, California yeast, WB001 is still my favorite. It was the first yeast I collected, used. I used in all my kind of home brewing that led into my home brewing collaboration, kind of led into White Labs and Ballast Point, and brewery in San Diego that did pretty well. So I still, we mostly brewed with California yeast. I like it. I like that you can ferment with the cold. I don't think it's as great as a warm fermentation yeast as people think, because it makes a little more acetaldehyde at warm temperatures, but it does great at cold temperatures. So I'm talking down to 62 Fahrenheit, which is, maybe 16, I guess, C, off the top of my head. Does that sound right?
Around there, yeah.
Yeah, pretty close.
You're more qualified than me for that.
I try to be bilingual on this, but sometimes when you're talking about a particular thing, but I think 62 is 17 or 16.
Are you seeing a few cold IPAs pop up in the US now?
Are people actually fermenting colder than that? Because I kind of went down to that temperature. Are they going colder than that?
But are you seeing more cold IPAs? Because I was reading recently that it's kind of a new style that some breweries are looking at. Is it appearing on the market at all, or not? There's nothing like as prolific as a hazies came on.
No, not prolific at all. But yes, it's happening. It's also kind of tied to this lager thing that's happening here, where people have been doing lager IPAs. And I'm seeing a lot of that. Actually, true lager yeast, lager fermentation temperatures, but IPAs. And that's been growing in popularity. You could always take a yeast strain colder. I mean, that's how lager yeast came around, right? I mean, in Bavaria, that area, hundreds of years ago, when people were fermenting cold and cold and cold, you can take ale yeast cold. You just got to have a lot of it, and you got to treat it good. But of course, then hybridization happened where lager yeast came out of a mix one day that fermented faster, colder.
Yeah. And that's they stuck with that one and said that's what we're going to go with.
I'm going to repitch that one.
Yeah.
Lager yeast was born.
Okay. Talk about yeast modification. What are your thoughts on genetically modified yeasts? Are there benefits worth the risks?
You know, it's a great question. It's a question I've been asked for 20 some years, maybe more now. I made GMO yeast before White Labs and pharmaceutical stuff, but White Labs is 26 years now. So GMO has been around a while. Look, I think it's a really complicated topic, but I can give you my opinions. I'm not anti-GMO. I think that they have been a boon to the pharmaceutical industry. But when it gets to food, it's a little more complicated. And it's not just the safety, it's the tradition of the food industry. You know, it's the small producers. There's becomes a lot more questions, I think, when it becomes food. And beer hasn't had GMO barley or hops or yeast until some recent times, things, even though things have been made in the lab. So whether you like it or not, of course, you can go through a lot of benefits of GMO yeast. But I think you have to ask yourself what the customer wants. What's that consumer want? And I just would like transparency. So not saying yes or no, right or wrong, but if you're going to use a GMO yeast, I'd like you to put it on the label. Because our industry has been about transparency. Beer, more than food and beverage, is weird, right? They lie. People lie. You know, look at the plant protein stuff going on, the plant-based meats and stuff, and the GMO stuff. It's all about fighting what you have to put on the label. All these core things about what you have to put on the label. Brewers put everything on the label. Where the beer is made, you know, investing in a brewery by itself doesn't make financial sense if there's a brewery down the street, but we do it because our customers want it. We're all about transparency. We're an old, ancient industry. And if you want to use a GMO yeast, great. But in my opinion, you should put it on the label.
Yeah, just
because
keep the customer informed.
You know, consumers are going to get mad if they find out later. Oh, you did that? Why didn't you put it on the label? If your answer is, well, I didn't have to, that doesn't work in this industry, in my opinion. So that's my little opinion.
Thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, right. I'm not saying, you know, that could sound like I'm anti. I'm not. I just am thinking about the consumer and the transparency our industry demands with the consumer.
Great point. And which yeast generation would best describe its original character? My experience tells me that the fresh propagate yeast is quite deviate.
You know, that was a textbook thing when I started. Like, okay, first generations are different, but after 26 years and selling a lot of first generations, I mean, they aren't that different, right? So, I mean, nobody's blending anything. There's no opportunity to blend anything. So, I can see that. I mean, all the beers we make here at White Labs are with first generation, just because we got it. But we do a little repitching, but we use so many different yeast strains. And it's about getting that pitching rate right. It's about having the right yeast health. It's about the fermentation itself. So I really don't, I mean, the yeast itself has a little more bud scars as you repitch it, which helps flocculation. There's some, the cells get a little bit bigger, but from the metabolism itself, there's no sensory data, you know, that I think that really backs up that it's different.
No.
If the oxygen's right. Yeah.
So it should be right from the beginning. It should be the perfect example.
I'd say if it's not in your brewery, there's a process thing in your brewery with how much yeast you're using or the fermentation or something that can be optimized to make it the same.
Right. So take a look at your processes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Chris, we don't want to keep you for too long. I know it's starting to get late over there. We've got.
Yeah, sun's gone down.
Yeah, we noticed. Old Abe behind you has gone.
Turn on a light.
We've got 5 questions in here. Do you want to give us some quick fire answers to the 5 questions?
I'll try.
Okay. Let's see what we can do.
Finish my Hellas.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We don't want your beer getting warm, so you'll have to go and get another one soon.
Well, we closed 17 minutes ago, so I think they're waiting for me. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, is there a perfect ratio for fermentation tanks to produce the cleanest kind of fermentation profile? As I read recently, fermenters higher than 3M high produce a less clean fermentation. So 3 meters high, I guess.
Yes. Open fermenters make happier yeast. Think about this. So I'm going to start with open. Not that many people are using open fermenters anymore, but the UK style open fermenters, you know, make the happiest yeast in the world. Are they the purest? Well, you know, there's that issue because they're open. But yeast love no pressure, no CO2. It's not the pressure, it's the CO2. So in an open fermenter, if yeast are happier, they're going to make more flavor compounds. So you want something cleaner? Yeah, a conical fermenter, a closed fermenter, pressure on the fermenter will make a cleaner, less ester beer. But most of what we're trying to do in craft does need some ester characteristic. Your Tigers, your any kind of lager beers, you know, they have esters. It's the right proportion. So I'm an open fermenter fan. There's just not many of them because that is what yeast like. Quick answer.
Quick answer. Okay. Chris, for yeasts like Californian yeast, London fog, etc., how much the pitch rate needs to be accurate for every batch of the same beer to avoid problem with sensory? I mean, when the pitch rate can start to influence and how much of fermentation and beer flavor.
Yes, a lot of writing about it, a lot of textbooks. I would say, just as a quick answer, if it really mattered, all our beer would not be good because not many people control the pitch rate. Right. So, I mean, you got all these breweries in the United States using liquid yeast, reusing liquid yeast at sort of on and off amounts, and around the world, of course, too, and in Asia. And if it made as much of a difference as we were scared about, our beers would not be good. So I'm a big believer in accurate cell counts and measuring and doing the lab work. But I think if you think about our beers and the success of the beers people have with a plus and minus, you can see how it works. And so you really need to be in the millions of cells per mil range. But whether you're at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it actually doesn't have as big a difference on sensory, because if you have the right amount of oxygen, the beer's the same final gravity with a similar flavor profile. But if you don't have the right amount of oxygen, then you're really getting touchy with different pitching rates.
Right. So keep an eye on the oxygen.
Yeah.
Okay. What's your opinion of sour beer trends going forwards?
Where's all the sour beer gone? Yeah, I love it. I love sour beer. Look, it's a very small percentage of the Belgian market. Maybe it'll be a smaller percentage of the world market. I mean, I remember being in China, a couple of years ago with Charles, and there was a poster about trying to get Chinese consumers interested in sour beers, but now sour beers seem to be going down in interest everywhere. but they'll always have a place. They're always hard to make. They're always interesting. I don't see it as a growth.
How much do you think sour beers? How much do you think the growth of sour beers had to do with brewers kind of burning out their palates with hops and going, look, we need something more refreshing, and it's kind of driven by the brewers as opposed to driven by the consumers?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much the hops. I just think it's the brewer creativity. It's a super creative way of making beer, and it's historical, and there's Belgium, and there's things that people doing. So I think it was more about creativity. But I think so many brewers have actually got burned out more because they're so expensive to make. It doesn't sound like they are, right? If you're, I'll just make a sour beer, but by the time you actually try to make it for as many months or years as you should, and the sourness that it should generate, and maybe kettle sours hurt it a little bit, real sour beers, because people found a faster way of making it, but really wasn't as good, in my opinion, as traditionally made sour beers with the complexity of the different acids. I don't see, I'm not seeing a lot of consumer interest in the United States or Asia, and Asia was always not that interested. So there's probably pockets there where people are interested. There's always pockets of interest you can make as another side brand, but I would not start a brewery as a sour beer brewery.
Yeah.
That, I know some that did 10 years ago, and now they just make hazies.
So keep it as a side project and not your core range.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. In repitching process cone to cone with a flow meter, can the density of shrub influence the pitch rate, or need to consider just the volume? I mean, if I know the concentration of yeast in volume, the weight can be a variant to calculate the volume that it needs to be pitched. Do you want to have another look at that one?
Yeah. I don't think you have to worry about trub too much. I mean, it's there. What we see is different strains capture different amounts of trub. It's not the beer style as much as the strain. The more flocculent strains tend to extrude the trub. Some capture the trub, so there's some hydrophilic stuff that goes on there. But at the end of the day, I don't think you really have to worry about it. We did lots of things with people trying to remove trub, not remove trub. It's another one of those things that a lot of effort to no results. Again, it's the scientist part. I'd say, hey, it's important. Get as specific as you can. Try to have your yeast as clean as you can. But in all the experiments we did, there's very little difference with that trub carryover. And it's more about the yeast strain itself, which still didn't have much impact. Your yeast looks darker with trub, right? So that can confuse you, like, oh gosh, there's something wrong with my yeast. It's darker. Well, that strain captures more of the trub.
Right. So it's not nothing to particularly worry about. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations for making Kolsch beer with dryness and fruity notes? Like what kind of yeast or fermentation temperature?
Yeah, well, I'd, a 3-hour mash might be nice. We don't experiment a lot with our mash times being longer because people think, oh gosh, conversion's over. No, it's not. There's a reason why Bud Light is a 3 or 4 hour mash. Anheuser-Busch, because they didn't want to use enzymes. That longer mash gives you more fermentable, drier beer. So we don't experiment that much on the craft brewing side with that, but if that was an interest on a really dry Kolsch and you didn't mind having a longer brew day, you're going to see a difference. So the idea that, oh, we're all converted because of this color, no. That's why an overnight mash with the sour mash and things like that makes such a difference. Enzymes are still working. And if you're talking about dryness, that's where it can kind of get critical if you want. So I think if you wanted to make a fruity dry Kolsch, you do a long mash. It's not the temperature as much as the time, because that's a little fallacy, a little bit of that enzyme temperature. They need the time and the right temperature. And then maybe use, an English style yeast, such as our English dry English ale yeast or something like that, to kind of add that ester character into that really dry Kolsch based beer.
Okay, so nice long mash is a recommendation for that.
Yeah, just go to lunch.
Okay, so last question. Here you go, and this is back to White Labs yeast. How many generations can I reuse when using lager yeast in liquid form from White Labs?
Oh, that's a really good question. So lager yeast don't grow as much in their cold fermentations. They're awesome yeast, but they're weird, right? Brewers yeast already at 20 is cold. I mean, most microbes like 30. So now we're taking lager yeast to, in that 10 to 15 range, and that's super cold. So you get less new cells. Anytime you get less new cells, you might not go the 5 or 10 generations. So we usually say 3 or 4 with lagers, but I can go to so many breweries and they say, oh gosh, I could get 10 generations out of my lager yeast. So it's kind of what I was saying earlier. As soon as we say you can't do something, you go to a brewery and they go, I get 10. It's easy.
Someone does it. Yeah.
But they have to make a lot of it, right? The longer your yeast sits, the more dormant it gets. So if you can make a beer, collect it and use it, you'll get more generations, regardless of the yeast strain or the type of yeast strain. It wants to be growing. Remember, when you have it cold or dormant, it's doing nothing. It wants to grow. It wants to eat. It wants to make new cells. So the more you can use it, the more generations you'll get. So then you want to think, okay, if I got a lager yeast and I want to get a whole bunch of generations, maybe I throw it in a porter or a Kolsch and I bring it back into a lager. So there's ways you can maybe use it in other styles, keep it going, and still get the lager generations you want.
But you would then recommend cone to cone transfer, just using it straight away or as quickly as you can.
It doesn't have to be cone to cone for you still collect it, look at it, add it to another fermentation, but it could be cone to cone. But if you just keep it going, you'll be a more creative brewer, because you'll think, okay, what can I do with this? Maybe make some kind of saison with some blend of your yeast, and I don't know. I'm just throwing out some, brewers are way more artistic than me and experimental. So just think about, what else can I do with this? Same thing with some of the other yeast strains that you say, well, gosh, I only have a one-off with this. Well, what else could you make with it? Make something else with it.
And it's quite okay to put it into something else and then bring it back and use it as a lager yeast and a lager again in the 3rd generation, for example.
Absolutely. Oh, you can bring it up temperature-wise, and you can bring it back down. That's not going to matter to a lager yeast.
Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't change its genetic material. What's important is that genetic material, right? And that regulation of the genetic material. Some things have an impact, like CO2 and things like that. Temperature, not so much. Not from what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much, Chris. The sun has gone down over there. Your beer's, I guess, is getting
My beer's
to
empty.
empty, so you got
to want to close the bar.
It looks like they turned. Yeah, it looks like they turned the lights off on you.
Even though I got a key, but I guess I didn't realize it was going to get so dark.
So, well, thanks very much for joining us, for taking the time to sit down with us today. It's been fascinating hearing your insights, and it was always fascinating hearing your insights and listening to you. So, really appreciate you joining. And thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm sorry about the technical issues earlier on.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Charles. Thanks everybody for the questions. Some of the people I know, thanks for asking questions. Hopefully you can try the PurePitch Next Generation when you're getting some orders, and give it a try. And if I look forward to getting back to Asia, if any of you come to San Diego, please come by. You know what? I'll even keep it open for you after 8 o'clock.
Brilliant. And that PurePitch Next Generation is already available to pack out to Asia as well.
Selling it right now. Yeah, we announced it this week. We've been making it for weeks and months, and so those 2 strains right now to change too. But if anyone wants California Ale yeast or London Fog yeast, I was thinking of, should I say number or the name? But we got it. We can send it to you next week.
Fantastic.
Or tomorrow.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's great. Always a pleasure to catch up. Speak to you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.